Well, hello, everybody, Kepler families. Welcome to another live with one of our teachers. And today we have Tricia Powell, the other Spanish teacher here at Kepler. Welcome,
Hola.
Tricia.
Hola.
So, hola and bienvenidos to everybody. We're going to talk Spanish instruction, Hispanic culture, our upbringings, and shining the light on Tricia, who is an experienced teacher, an experienced Spanish teacher, and we're absolutely delighted to have her here at Kepler. Now, when we were talking off camera, and we were talking a little bit about your background, you kind of put on a joking, jovial tone and said, I was born a poor Puerto Rican child with no rhythm, which was absolutely hilarious. And I hope I didn't steal your thunder with that. But I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about your upbringing. Do you truly lack rhythm and
I
other
do.
things that the people want to know?
I absolutely do. Um, I, that I absolutely do. Which is really weird because I absolutely love the arts. I have two very artsy children. I've introduced them to the arts, and I have a dancer. I have another one that's an artist, and I couldn't draw a stick figure if you paid me $1 million. And so I lack talent and all that. But I actually was born to a single mom. My mother was a single parent, and I was born, all Puerto Rican families, mostly all Hispanic families, are Catholic. So
Mm-hmm.
my grandparents were Catholic, so I grew up in the church in that aspect. But my mother, being a teenage mother and single parent, left home with me when I was 7 years old, and she brought me to the States. We came to Florida, and at that point, I didn't know any English. All I could say in English was hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good night. That was the extent of my vocabulary. And in Florida, they wanted to put me in those, I guess, special ed classes for children that don't know English.
Yeah.
And my mother was very feisty. I wonder where I get it from. And I never forget, I was in the principal's office, and clear memories that I have of my childhood, this is one of them. My mother sat in the principal's office and looked at them and said, she will go in class with everybody else. She
Mm-hmm.
will learn Spanish. You will not treat my child like a victim. She's like, if she doesn't learn it, then she suffers. She gets a bad grade. English. She will learn the language. And
Wow.
I just sat there like, all I know how to say is hello, good morning. What are you kidding me? And I was fully immersed 100% in the English language and the English culture. Like, bam, second grade, beginning second grade. And that's how my journey started in the US. The reason I ended up fully bilingual, we can thank my grandpa, is because my grandfather, my mother's parents, insisted that I go to Puerto Rico over the summers, and they miss me and they want to spend more time with me, which is fine. I miss them too. But my father, and as an adult, I'm sure you see that as well. You pass culture through language, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our culture is communicated not just in speaking, but through language, right? And not just in learning in a book, hola, ¿cómo estás? It's also speaking it and being immersed in that culture. So my father insisted that I go to Puerto Rico and in the summers, and so I was a year-round schooler. I would go to school in the summer, and I would take gramática, grammar, and history. And I would study the history of Puerto Rico and the poets and oratoria, which is, I try to explain oratoria in English to people, and I
Well,
don't
this
have.
is a classical education platform. I feel like oratory would be good enough,
Yeah, and
but it's a sort of rhetoric, right?
yeah, it is. And
Speech
so
making.
I told one of my kids one time, I was like, it's kind of like Def Jam poetry. I was like, I was like, I was like, 'cause you have to act it out. You have to like
I'm
feel the
picturing you as a
passion.
13-year-old just free. styling.
You have to put the passion in it, you know? And so I was like, I don't know, think of it as Def Jam poetry. And one of my students was like, I don't get that, but okay. So I would have to go in. And then finally, in 7th grade, my dad said I was starting to sound too much like a gringa. And so I spent the entire year, the scholastic year of 7th grade in Puerto Rico. I came back to the States in 8th grade. And then they decided, it was like that 9th and 10th grade I would spend in Puerto Rico, and 11th and 12th I would spend in the state in the States. So my education was completely split in half from 7th grade to 12th grade.
How about that? Well, hello, not only to our Puerto Rican audience, but also to our Chilean audience.
Hola.
So
yeah, they speak pretty Spanish. They don't speak it like us. They speak it pretty.
I don't know. Yeah, there's there have been a lot of Peruvian immigration to Chile recently, and people in Chile have started joking that everyone's Spanish is better because the Peruvians are arriving. But yeah, so that's actually, let's talk a little bit about that. You have this Caribbean Spanish, and clearly, as I watch you talking and bouncing, you've got a Caribbean flair as well. And I'm bringing sort of a more South American aspect to things. I'd absolutely love to talk about culture. Some of maybe your, being a Spanish teacher, one of the joys of that is that there are so many different cultures that get opened up through Spanish. I actually had a student this past term who was in the Dominican Republic, and she was learning Dominican Republic Spanish at the same time as she was in my class. And as you can imagine, that led to a lot of excitement. But yeah, so I'd absolutely, you're there in Florida. I don't know if you're in South Florida now, but there's just, okay, so such a medley of Hispanic cultures. So I would just love for you to wax eloquent on just that mix of cultures.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things, at least for Hispanics, that I have found, and I'm sure you can piggyback on that. We're very proud, and not proud in an ugly way. We're very proud of our heritage, of our specific culture, and it's like we don't want to be. We are very united as a Hispanic people. I find that, you meet another Hispanic and it's like you just met a brother, but yet we're very proud of our specific heritage and where we land on that heritage wheel. And it's almost like, like if you're in a place where there's too much of one grouping, it's like, look, tacos is not the only Hispanic food. I love me some tacos, but that's not the only Hispanic.
Yeah. You're talking my language now. Yeah, I mean, I had to move to. I lived in Florida for a long time. I had to move to South Carolina to start interacting with Mexicans. But people just assumed that I had some sort of relationship to Mexican food and Mexican culture. Absolutely none. But once I moved to South Carolina, I did.
Yep. I mean, I lived in Colorado, so the Mexican food was abundant and it was delicious. It was great. But then people would see, Puerto Rican, oh, do you make tacos? I'm like, no, we make arroz y habichuela con gandules, pernil. I'm like, we don't make any of that. So it's like, there's other food other than tacos, so yeah.
Well, it's kind of interesting from my perspective as a Brazilian. I mean, so my dad's Brazilian, my mom's American, but my mom was raised in Peru. So I have this strange connection to Hispanic culture, in that there's this American, I have American family who speak Spanish who still live in Chile and in Peru, and there's this there's that connection there. But my mom grew up as an expat. My aunt is a very proud Peruvian citizen, but she is her last name was Bernstein, and she's very, very fair, and definitely she's as acculturated as a gringa can be, but she's that. And then my dad's Brazilian, and you should hear my dad's prepared rant on how he is not Hispanic because he's Brazilian, right? I don't speak Spanish, and so there's all online. There are so many fun like just skits and videos and just fun comedy bits about the interaction of all the different Hispanic cultures. And the Brazilian is always like on the outside, because they're not Hispanic, but they're Latin American.
Yes.
And so that leads to all this sort of weirdness. But certainly as a semi-outsider in Florida, it was just delightful to see the Venezuelans and the Cubans and the Colombians and all of that mixing so wonderfully. My wife is sort of dark, but her descendants, her family are all English and Irish, but she's kind of dark. So and she's from West Palm Beach. So people would walk up to her in the street and just start speaking Spanish. As she was growing up, and she had absolutely no background, no reason to speak Spanish, but that's how Hispanic it kind of gets down there. People think they can talk to you in Spanish on the street.
I've taken friends to Puerto Rico with me that are more like dark skin, and they go and people just start speaking Spanish to them, and just like, I don't know what they're saying. I'm like, I know.
Well, speaking of knowing, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's easy to do. But speaking of knowing what they're saying, let's talk about teaching and learning Spanish. Maybe tell us a little bit about your background. So you have a pretty wide background as an educator, but one of the things you've certainly done for a while is to teach Spanish. So maybe talk about your background in that.
My background as an educator actually began when I took worldview training. Actually, no, it started when I started homeschooling. And I started homeschooling actually. Talk about bizarre. It's a God thing how I ended up homeschooling. It always is a God thing. When I first got saved years ago, the first ministry I worked with was the youth group. And in this youth group, in this church, it was just a very thriving youth group. At least of our core group, there were about 40 kids of our core group that were homeschoolers. I had never heard of homeschooling. And by the time my husband and I got married and got engaged and got married, we actually went to a homeschooling conference because I was so curious as to how is this homeschooling thing? What kind of cult is this? And so we actually went. We didn't even have children. Talk about being flies on the wall. We went to a homeschooling conference, no kids, never seen curriculum, but being a book lover, I was like, I'm at home. I love this place. Look at all the books. And so we checked out homeschooling, but at the time I said, I can never do this on my own. I need a network. I need a support system. There's just no way I could do this on my own. I was like, if God calls me to that, he's going to have to give me a group. And so when I moved, we were in Colorado at the time, my husband and I, and in Colorado, right when it was time to send my kids to school, I didn't want to. I was such burden that I just did not want to put them in the school system. And it just burdened me so bad, but I just kept praying about it and asking the Lord what to do with that. And that weekend at our church, and I've been at that church for a year, and that weekend at the church, there's a on the bulletin, homeschoolers meetup. I was like, there's homeschoolers in this church? And I was like, wait a minute.
Wait, the cult has expanded. They're in our church.
They're here. And so I ran to the meeting, and that woman, actually, she's graduated her kids. Her kids were my kids' babysitters, and her kids actually have children now. She was a mentor to me, and just amazing, just carried me through those initial years of homeschooling. And I landed on the classical model, mostly. All the humanities people will appreciate this, mostly because my husband had a full 100% classical education, and my husband insisted that whatever we did grammar wise must have the sentence diagramming. And so like I said, all the humanities people here will totally appreciate that. So I'm like, okay, I'll hunt that down. So that's how I landed into the classical model, because usually you don't find that unless you're in the classical arena. Right. You don't see it in traditional grammar being taught. And then I just fell in love with the classical model. I loved it. and we used Omnibus Veritas Press curriculum, and I just loved it. My oldest devoured every book. She just devoured everything. My youngest was not as avid of a reader. She just didn't like it. We did more read aloud with her, so I had to switch with her and be more Charlotte Mason approach. But we still got all.
That's the joy of homeschooling, right?
It
That
is.
you can
It
be
is.
flexible like that.
It is. It was a beautiful thing. So that's really my initial in education. How I ended up in the online environment was because I was doing grassroots work in the pro-life movement and working in that. One of my dear friends that I was working with her in certain in politics and stuff, she actually told me, you need to go to worldview training. And I was like, no, it's okay, I'll pass. It's like, I'm good. And she just kept bugging me to do this. And I'm just like, I don't have the time to do this. And I filled out my application, kind of like just to shush her up. I filled it out, sent it in. And next thing you know, I got a call that I got accepted into the program. I was like, and one of the
I'm committed now.
I actually tried to get out of it because that's just the way I am. I did my best to get out of it, and the head of the ministry contacted me. I didn't even know who this person was, and so I just thought it was somebody's admin calling me. And and he told me, is that we've prayed over your application and we think you need to be here. And I was like, okay, that's nice. And I was like, have a nice day. Hung up, and I tell my husband looks up the person's name. He's like, sweetie, you're going. And I was a mess. I did not know what to do with myself. I was like, no, I don't want to. And I spent like a whole week saying I don't want to. And then I went. And that literally was a life changer for me. I mean, I was a Christian since the age of 25, but getting worldview training, and I've always been a reader, and I've always read well, but putting that umbrella and that training, it was that undergirding that really just solidified everything for me. And one of the things in my practicum was that I had to teach. And I was like, oh, I just teach my kids. It's okay. I don't know how to teach other people this. So I had to teach. And I was, it was like, but I don't know how to teach. I don't know how to do this. And so, but it was in my practicum. So that's how I started teaching. And a dear friend suggested that I teach that course in an online environment, which is how I started. And then I've been doing that ever since. And then that same friend actually, and then I started teaching Spanish and teaching. So that was really how I started. And then I realized that, I really, really loved teaching. And I knew I loved teaching my kids. I always knew that. I love teaching them, and I like seeing their eyes of wonderment open.
Yeah.
But I realized that I love the fact that the Lord would allow me the gift of taking other people's children on that journey of learning. And I just really was like, wow. And at the end of every year, I just sit back because I always have a prayer journal for all my students. I keep a prayer journal, pray for them throughout the year. And at the end of the year, I always say, I cry at the end of every class, like a big baby. I cry. And I'm just so thankful that the Lord just gives me the gift of letting me do it again. I was like, you mean I get to do this again? I'm like, okay.
I love that you cry. And I do want to say, like, my wife talks about how frequently I cry. Viewers should not be scared by the fact that they're making their Hispanic teachers cry.
No, not at all. It's very humbling. It's very humbling. It's very humbling because I bring worldview into everything. Everything I bring it back to Christ. And everything that we do has to be done to the glory of God. So
Amen.
Everything, even teaching a foreign language. So it's like, it's like bringing those kids to center, and that center being Christ. So it's just in any piece that you get to be a part of forming that Christ character. It's just very humbling. It just is. And I've always told all the kids, when we all get to heaven, my mansion will have a coffee shop. So look me.
Just stop on by. I think it's very natural to me that you start teaching some worldview courses and some humanities courses, and next thing you know, you're teaching Spanish. I homeschooled, and that when we moved up from Brazil, my parents is sort of, I went to a public school 1 year, and then my parents were like, "We're going to try this relatively new thing, this homeschooling thing, because it's crazy up here." And homeschooling in the 90s, there were even fewer resources, and very quickly my mom was teaching Spanish at the local co-op. There are certain needs that are a little more difficult for homeschoolers to fulfill sometimes, particularly when a state requires X.
Yes.
And one of the things that a lot of states do, in fact, require out of an education is 2 years of a foreign language. In the classical model, you can go for Latin, you can go for Greek. There are a lot of choices that you have, but fulfilling that language requirement. Besides, it's just good for people to study languages, but thinking of it as a requirement, that can be a challenge for a lot of homeschooling families. So obviously you got roped in, right? That seems to me a very natural
exactly
thing.
What happened. They're like, wait a minute, you speak Spanish fluently? You can read and write it? I'm
Get in there.
Yes. You need to teach that. Why?
Yeah.
And then
it seemed very natural.
Trying to, how do I do this? And then it was, I think you learn when you teach. I think we learn more, honestly, as a teacher. And I know that every teacher says this, and I know people hear it and they're like rolling their eyes, but it's so true. We learn so much more when we're teaching than, and I think I walk away really wow, that was good, and especially when I see the light bulbs go on, right?
Yes.
Like that light bulb, and you're like, oh, I did it, yeah.
Well, I'm going to take a moment here. Daniel, come on over and say hi. Everybody, this is our CEO, Daniel Fucachon. We could argue about the definition of Latin. He's French, so that counts as Latin, right? Are we going to include him in the group? Anyway, we're talking about Spanish education.
Oh, very good.
Thanks for popping in, Daniel. I just wanted to introduce everybody to Daniel. He is not always a public face of our company, but he's a jovial fellow and worth meeting. Actually, Tricia, I can't hear you. Can you hear me? Okay, hold on one second. Maybe can you hear me? Okay, I can't hear you. Might you have messed with your mic while you were getting excited about meeting?
No, there
we are.
Cool. All right. I said French is like your Portuguese. It's pretty Spanish.
Well, I'll tell him you said that. I know he'll love it. Well, let's actually talk a little bit about, because we were talking about how homeschoolers need that language education, and how, of course, you just got shoved in there in your local co-op because, hey, you speak Spanish, right? We need this. Let's talk a little bit about teaching styles, because as we were off camera preparing for this, we were just talking about our own approaches, and it's a priority for both of us to make students comfortable with speaking, with just saying stuff out loud. And it's perhaps a bigger mental barrier than some families and some parents might realize. And so, as we were talking, the two big ways in which we do that are through drills and through games.
Yes.
And I'm particularly interested in hearing you talk about how you integrate games and such like activities into an online education platform.
I learned that the hard way because I would teach the class and then I give a quiz, and then the students were getting some of the things but not others, and I'm just like, I thought we all were on the same page in class. What happened? And so I realized that if we drilled more during class, not after class. I think unlike math, like when you teach math, you need to drill more on your own and do more drilling. I think in a Spanish class environment, you need to do more of that drilling in class. And so that I've learned that by doing more of that in class, we play online games. So I always have my students download quizzes. I've tried Kahoot as well. And so we play online games. So they play for speed and they get on teams. And so
No, I've used Quizlet and Kahoot and things like that before. Even in a physical classroom, they're a wonderful tool. But maybe you could explain to some of our viewers what those are.
Okay, what quizzes is basically, you can go online. It's a game. It's an online game environment. Not necessarily. It's like flashcards. So you can go online and you can create different quizzes. So you can create a quiz where it's just flashcards. You can create a quiz where it's multiple choice. You can create multiple types of quiz environments, or you can borrow, because sometimes you just Google like AR conjugation.
Other teachers have made quizzes.
And other teachers have made them, and you look through them. I was like, okay, that looks good. And you can pull that if the teacher has made it public. And so one of the things that I have students do, I said, there's some that I already have in my library that I've built in. So when we're working on a specific lesson, we can go to that quizzes, and I can make a game out of it. So, or I can send them the link to it, and they can have the link to the game, and they can drill and practice it on their own. So
and these games kind of happen in real time if you're doing them in the classroom. So Johnny and Susie, are competing to accomplish the same things in real time.
Exactly. And or you can send them the link, because there is a way to just send the link to the student, and they can drill themselves and practice the game. So those are ways that it makes the class more interactive, and it takes, okay, we just learned this conjugation, or we just practiced the definite or indefinite articles. Let's see if you understood that. Because in Spanish, unlike in English, we have a feminine, a masculine, a singular, and a plural for everything. So it's a different transition, I have found, for that English speaker to understand that it's not just plural and singular, it's also feminine and masculine. I find, here's a shameless plug for the Latin folks, that students that have taken Latin, when they come into my class, have a much, the curve is a lot lower. They catch on a lot quicker. So if you're in elementary school now, you have students different ages. And you, in any language you wanted to do, even doing Latin at the small age group is going to help them for whatever language they decide to pick. So there's a shameless plug for those that are teaching.
Yeah, well, that's great. And my background as a teacher, my primary work was actually not as a Spanish teacher. I've always taught Spanish, but my primary work is actually teaching English to non-native speakers. And English speaking students may not love hearing this, but English is grammatically a very simple language, which means almost any language you move to, you're going to face some extra challenges because there's just all these new concepts you're going to have to face. But if you've studied, I think particularly Latin is useful to just introducing all these grammatical concepts to one, and if you're doing that in elementary school, what a great preparation for whatever it is you decide to do through middle and high school.
Because in America, we don't start teaching languages, which is really the hiccup. We don't start teaching languages at a young age. So to me, it's like, well, since we don't do that and it's not the norm, then instill the Latin, that base, because then when they get to middle school, you get them to, the dialectic and the rhetoric stage, and you want to pick a language, your student is going to have a bit of an advantage, because they're going to understand declensions. They're going to understand, so this is what we have to, shift here and do this. So they're going to get that a lot easier than if they've never had any exposure at all to any language or anything other than English. So I have found that my students that have had Latin do really well in my class.
So, so you're hearing here from us, two Spanish teachers at Kepler. Kepler starts in 7th grade, but we are both absolutely recommending to viewers that in elementary school is a great time to already begin studying some language. But let's talk a little bit about the Spanish 1 course. And, it is designed for people who have no experience. So, it's certainly there's no need to have studied Latin. As people embark in your Spanish 1, what are the first few things they start to tackle? And I know you have an emphasis on beginning to be comfortable with speaking right away.
Yes, because really, I think what a lot of English speakers don't understand is that even if, because some students that I've had wanted to go to a mission trip that summer, and I was like, you know what? Just as much as you're afraid to speak, that Spanish speaker that has no exposure to English is afraid to even say hello to you. They're afraid of it sounding wrong. So let's break that barrier of that fear. So we always start out with the basics. Like I said, any age, whether you have language or not. But like I said, for those that have younger kids and older kids, work on certain things, give your younger kids an advantage. But either way, I start very basic with your alphabet, your pronunciation, and that is just your basic vowels, the pronunciation of that. The alphabet is pretty much the same, which is what's easy, makes Spanish easier, because our alphabet is almost identical except for the
Yep.
ñ, which has the tilde. And when I was growing up, we used to say ella. Now they just say doble L. And then we used to have the R. And now they just say, they just say R, or because it was either R or R.
We're talking about that double R for the for the viewers. It's a double R.
So now we just say doble R. Now it's just say doble L, doble R. That's kind of like how they say it now. And then the CH. So the real only different letters that we have are the CH and the N with the tilde. That sounds like canyon, like nye. It sounds like that. And so we practice that pronunciation and get through that. And then we start out really basics, the definite, indefinite articles, and the singular and the plural, and just very, very basic things that they can see and identify and just formulate a simple sentence. And then from there, we build on conjugation, which is really that's where I find that English speakers have the harder time making.
That's the first big stumbling block.
That's the first big stumbling block for anybody, whether you're learning Spanish or French, because you have that in French, you have that in so I'm trying to think. I think everybody does conjugation except English speakers.
Well, yeah, I mean, we do conjugate. It's just a secret conjugation.
You conjugate. I tell the kids all the time, you guys conjugate the person, you don't conjugate the verb.
Yeah.
It's like
I use the subjunctive in English, and that actually a lot of Americans will why do you talk so funny? And this English has a subjunctive, but nobody uses it. But I can't help myself. I just I have to use it just because of the Latin brain.
Yes.
I'm not. Anyway, conjugation is a very weird beast in English. It's actually as frightening as it is for an English speaker to approach conjugation in Spanish. Once you start getting used to it, it's much less irregular.
Yes.
So in a sense, it's actually less frightening. You just have to meet Spanish conjugation and become comfortable with it.
Yes. And I do it, and I build houses. I build little houses. I use my easel, and we build houses, and we put the singular on one side, the plural on the other. And so I tend to tell students to use a lot of visuals until it becomes natural, to just have flashcards and use as many visual tools as possible until those things become natural. And for speaking, we memorize the Bible, because what better way to learn how to speak? Start memorizing the Bible, and we do memory verses. So, and my students, by the end of the year, the goal for me for Spanish 1 is to get students to be able to say El Padre Nuestro. So that's
Our Father. That's Our Father for the viewer, yes.
And to get that done at the end of the year, because it's a bigger chunk, right? Because normally they just do small verses, and once they get comfortable, it's like, these are small verses, I can handle this. And then the goal is to build that confidence. So at the end of the year, one of their final projects is to be able to say El Padre Nuestro, and that they can also use all the vocabulary that we've learned and we've used. And one of the projects that I have is that they build me a brochure, a travel brochure, and they're going to go to, and this also lets them study the culture. They have to go find the country, tell me about this country, and find me a mission. I tell them, you're basically writing me a brochure. You're sending me on a mission trip to this country. Find the missionary, a place that I'm going to serve. How am I going to serve? And it has to all be done using the Spanish vocabulary that we've practiced, and all of that put together. So they get a writing, audio assignment, and obviously their test. So it gets a combination, kind of bringing it all together.
Yeah, I love it. Well, and speaking of culture, I'd like to, as we approach the end of our stream, talk a little bit, just, about your, just your culture and your background. Tell me about your relationship with coffee.
My relationship with coffee, I don't know, but some people say it's bad, but I have to have it. I have an addiction to coffee. And it's just, my grandmother, when I was little, from time I was like maybe 2 feet tall. It was just normal. We go and sit at the table and have some galletitas, little crackers, soda crackers, and that came in a green can. I don't know if you've ever seen those.
Mm-mm.
Those export sodas, Keebler export sodas that come in a green can. And we'd have our galletitas and our coffee. And it's more than just a drink. It's just it was a time with my grandmother. It was a time to sit down and talk about the day. I think coffee is a great relationship builder.
Yeah, it is. It is. You have a relationship with coffee so that you can build relationships with humans. It is. I mean, just coming over for coffee, and I imagine, coming into your home, or just coming into, into a Hispanic home, you will be served coffee.
Yes.
I mean, my mother had to learn to drink coffee when she moved to Brazil. Because she couldn't, you would be rude to not be a coffee drinker.
Yes. And what I find, and I'm convinced I dropped my children on their heads, they want to drink cold coffee. And that's like, what are you doing? You're breaking my heart. What are you doing drinking cold coffee? That's blasphemy. My kids are heretics. They drink cold coffee.
Oh, gasp. Well, that kind of thing is becoming more popular south of Miami.
Yes, it is. I say, but we always had it hot. As like I was telling you earlier, it didn't matter if it was 90 degrees outside. You'd go and have a nice little, you could sit there under a breeze and have a little guava, un pastel de guayaba and some coffee. And it was like a beautiful day. It's like, and people, I don't do cold coffee.
Yeah. So let me ask a Puerto Rican sister here. Do you guys have a name for the combination of guava paste and white cheese?
Oh my goodness, that is so delicious. Un pastelillo de, I'm going to get hungry after this. Okay. It's
well, we call it a Romeo and Juliet.
Oh no, we just got un pastelillo de guayaba. Un pastelillo de guayaba. It's like, and then
we used to have a classic combination.
It is, and we used to have a guy like I don't know if you guys had these, but my husband went to New Orleans and he sends me a picture of a beignet, and I'm like, oh, those are Mallorcas. Because we used to have a guy that used to drive around every Saturday morning in his Oldsmobile 1970s Buick or whatever that car was, selling bread out of his car with a big siren, and in the front there were all the Mallorcas, the beignets, and we go out in the car, give him $1, get our bread, get our beignets, and go back in.
Oh, nice. Well, one of the cool things to do with Spanish students is to connect them to one's own culture, to the various cultures that Spanish touches. Do you have any, and I know I'm putting you on the spot here because you may not, but do you have any stories of students who were able to make some kind of cultural connection because of your class?
I actually had one student that was in Puerto Rico when she was taking my class. So she was in Puerto Rico. So all the stuff I would talk about, she was like, she would go and see it. I'm here. I'm actually in this country. I'm like, you've got to eat this. You've got to go to this place. You got to go to this kiosquito on the beach. So I did have one who actually, her parents were military, her dad, and they were stationed in Puerto Rico at the time she was taking the class. So.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. That's actually, immediately applicable. That's pretty great. Well, thank you so much for connecting with us and for talking with us about, just all this stuff. I'm excited about being able to collaborate with these beginning Spanish students and then moving them on together into Spanish too. Yes. So Tricia, thanks so much for spending time with us. Do stay on the line after we say goodbye to everybody, but really appreciate you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
So long, everybody.